Hi, so welcome to day 2 of the credentialing course for DTGSS. Remember, our essential question is, what do skillful leaders believe, know, and do individually and collectively to shift the culture of their school from a focus on teaching to a focus on learning? Today our objectives are really around performance area 2, those objectives for learning, checking for understanding, and criteria for success. We're going to use balance analysis to write about practices in performance area number 2, and we're going to diagnose problems in lesson planning. So let's get started. Performance area 2. All 6 areas, colored tan here, on the pyramid are part of the curriculum function on this map of generic pedagogy. Now, several school districts and charter schools use high-quality instructional materials and programs. There needs to be high-quality curriculum aligned to standards, and we need to have the skills to assess that curriculum and implement that curriculum. So teachers need to know about planning and the skills associated with it so that they can make sense of and affect use of materials in a way that match the needs of their students. Now, we won't have time today to skim through 441, 442, but if you take note of those pages, you can do that after this presentation. So let's talk about planning. This is an essential component of teaching, as you know. And why is planning important? Well, planning is important because often sources of problems are because of lack of planning. So, for example, something that might look like a management problem or a clarity problem could really be a planning problem. So, if the teacher hasn't unpacked the objective for the unit and figured out in what order to teach each chunk of knowledge or which skills to be reviewed and strengthened, could result in behavior issues or clarity issues. So planning is critical. Now, we talk about backward design, this work of Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe. And if you think about the teachers in your buildings, would they be a thumb up? Teachers in our school use backward design when developing curriculum and planning. Would they be a thumb down? They're not familiar with the concept. Or would they be sort of in the middle, that they know about this concept and they might use it routinely and consistently, but not consistently when planning a lesson. So if you're like a lot of the folks that have gone through this training, you're probably somewhere in the middle there. So what do we mean by backward design? Backward designs are really determining, first starting with what those results are. What do you want the students to know and be able to do? Identifying the desired results. And then the second one is, how will I know if the students achieved it? What assessments will I use? What will be the qualities that must be present in the work to demonstrate mastery? And then the third step, it's not where we start, but it's what activities best match the learning needs of my students to get these results. So oftentimes we plan with the step 3 as really step 1, but identifying what the students will know and be able to do is the first step. And these principles of backward designs are often used to plan an entire curriculum, course, or unit, but this principle absolutely applies to the planning of a lesson. Okay, so let's take a look at these steps again. Notice that the first question is not what activities will I plan, or even how will I explain this idea. The first step is being clear about the results. What do I want students to know or be able to do or be better at the end of the course, unit, or lesson? The desirable results for a daily lesson is embodied in the objective. Now, this diagram that you see on this page was created by Dr. John Safier from Research for Better Teaching. And according to Dr. John Safier, the first step is planning the objective. The mastery objective. What do I want students to know or be able to do when the lesson is over, and how will I assess whether they know it or can do it? When we think about this thinking skill objective, that would be something that in order for the mastery objective to be achieved, the students have to have this thinking skill ability. So this could be thinking like, maybe the objective is students will be able to compare and contrast 2 different artists within 2 different time periods of history. Well, the thinking skill objective there is compare and contrast. Do students understand how to do that? So teachers might need to plan a mini lesson and have it a thinking skill objective inside the bigger mastery objective of comparing and contrasting the two artists. So after the objectives are determined, the next part of the diagram is coverage. So what knowledge, concept, or skill am I going to teach, and how am I going to present this? The next step in order is activities. What activities could students do to gain understanding or to develop these skills? And then the fifth step is involvement. How can I get all students actively engaged? So the end is the objective, plan with the objective in mind, and then the means to that end are the coverage, the activities, and the involvement. So this is what we mean by backward design. So let's take a look at this idea of objectives, lesson objectives. Notice on the framework those bold-faced words in 2.1, objectives for learning, that highlight the importance of what are we looking for in the classroom when we look for lesson objectives. We're looking for objectives that are aligned to standards. We're looking for objectives that are written in student-friendly language, that are clearly communicated and accessible, revisited often throughout the lesson. Maybe at the end of the lesson, the teacher might say something like, okay, boys and girls, let's refer back to the things that we're learning today in your journals. Answer that question, or tell me what you learned about that objective today. And students are able to articulate it and tell why it's important to know it. So objectives are the control towers for decisions about student learning targets, instructional planning, how to gather formative data. So we think about those criteria as I just read through on the framework. And there are three parts of an objective. When we say a clearly articulated objective includes a learner or subject, the students will be able to, or you will be able to. Oftentimes at the lower levels, you see the I can statements. In pre-K through second grade, you might see I can statements. It has an active performance verb, and it's around a content focus, curricular knowledge or skill to be learned. So that's what a clearly articulated objective includes. Learner or subject, active performance verb, focus on curricular knowledge or skill. These verbs that you see on this page, we do not want to use them when writing objectives. Why? Because they're not observable, they're not measurable, they don't inform students about what they will have to do to demonstrate mastery, and that cannot be assessed in one lesson. Students will be able to understand. So how do you measure that? How do you observe that? Students will be familiar with, well, how do you know that? So we want to avoid verbs like that when writing objectives or when observing a lesson and the teacher has a posted objective, being aware of the language used in communicating that objective. So instead of learn, students will be able to explain, or you will be able to explain. So the three essential elements are the STEM, it's about the student, the action, performance verb, and the content focus, new knowledge or new skill. So let's go through and figure out if some of these objectives that have been seen in classrooms actually meet those criteria. So you will be able to complete the Unit 6 vocabulary worksheet. Does this objective meet all of those criteria? Learner or subject, active performance verb, content focus. So you're thinking in your mind, and I know you're probably thinking, no, it does not meet that. We do have learner or subject. We do have a verb, complete. But is that an active performance verb? Is that a high leverage active verb that kids are going to complete a unit worksheet? So it's kind of like there is a verb, but what's the content focus? What's the vocabulary worksheet about? What's the knowledge or new skill used? So that is a no. Students will be able to demonstrate two passing skills in soccer, lead passes and passing the ball on the ground directly in front of a teammate. Okay, yes or no, think in your head. And this one would be yes. Learner as subject, students, active performance verb will demonstrate, content focus, lead passes, and passing the ball on the ground in front of a teammate. So that's a good one. I want students to be able to compare and contrast two characters of mice and men in terms of physical appearance, personality, attributes, and actions. So does this objective meet all the criteria? And if you're like me, you're thinking no, because learner as subject is missing. I want is not learner as subject. Now, active performance verb, yes. Compare and contrast. Content focus, yes. The two characters in mice and men. But the learner is not the subject. Easy fix here, students will be able to, and then the rest of it would fit fine. So communicating the objective. So we're going to take a look at this story about Sally and the Gophers, and it's on this page here. And as I read to this for you, just kind of think about the meaning of it. So Sally first let loose a team of gophers, but that plan backfired when the dogs chased them away. Then she threw a party, but the guests failed to bring their motorcycles. Furthermore, her stereo system wasn't loud enough. Sally spent the next day looking for a peeping Tom, but she couldn't find one in the Yellow Pages, and her friends certainly didn't know any. Sally has good friends. Then she went to obscene phone calls, and that gave her some hope. But then her telephone number was changed. It wasn't until she finally installed the blinking neon lights on her house across the street from the other one. She had found the ads in the classified section where she could get those neon lights. That finally did the trick, and she pasted them on the wall in celebration. So if you're like me, you're a little bit confused probably about what this is all about. Why? Because Sally forgot to write the objective. What is the objective that Sally's trying to achieve? And her objective is to get rid of the obnoxious neighbor. She wants to get them out. So if we put that in the front, then the rest of it makes sense. These are all the things Sally did to get rid of her obnoxious neighbors. So the importance of setting objectives for students and revisiting them throughout the lesson, clearly communicating them and having them accessible to students so that they are able to articulate what they're learning and why. Now, when you communicate objectives, they don't always have to be in statement form. They could also be asked as a question. So in statement form, it might read, by the end of today's lesson, you will be able to explain how Greece's physical characteristics influenced human settlement. But as a question to be answered, it could be written, how did the physical geography of Greece influence where human settlements were established? This works probably best maybe with a higher education, like middle and high school, and maybe with content areas, like social studies or science. Or even math, where they're exploring or discovering something, math or science. But putting objectives on the board is not enough. We have to revisit them throughout the lesson, refer back to them so students remember what they're learning. It might look and sound like this. What is it again that we're learning today? Remember, everyone, we are focusing on learning too. So we are doing this activity because it will help you to identify. Let's wrap up by going back to our objective. Here's the question we set out to answer. In your journals, Marianne, what did you learn today about? So these are the things that you want to be listening for as you're out observing for these 2.1 objectives for learning. So there was a video that was shown with day 2 called The Primary and Secondary Sources. I don't have access to this video. I will not be able to show you that. But it does, in a gist, the teacher spent time unpacking the objectives. And the goal was for students to research about primary and secondary sources. They already learned the meaning of primary and secondary sources, but as the teacher was unpacking the objective, by the data that he was receiving through the thumbs up, thumbs down, he realized that students didn't understand clearly the difference between primary and secondary. So he spent some time reviewing those definitions, giving examples so students had a clear understanding of what they were doing to eliminate and eliminates confusion later. In your binders on page 450 or 495 and 496, there are some examples and resources for how to reference the objective outside of putting it on the board. As you read through 87 to 90, teachers, the administrators are asked to think about instruction, what was wrong with the instructional delivery, in what ways might the issues have been related to planning, We won't have time to do that today, but you certainly can go back and reference that at a later point. The bottom line is this: when you see a problem in planning, so you see a concern, so you go out and about, you walk around, you check other classrooms. If you notice a pattern across the school or grade level, that's an indication that you need some professional development. So suppose the teachers in your building simply are posting the objective and they're not revisiting it. They're not putting it in student-friendly language. And it's not just one classroom, it's a lot of classrooms. So this would drive professional development, and everybody in the school would get feedback on that. Well, suppose you go in and you notice that this is a problem in only 2 or 3 individual classrooms. Well, that's where you can give some supervision and evaluation and be very clear with those teachers about what the objective means when we mean revisit it and not just have it posted. So it's focused improvement with individuals. So if it's a building-wide issue that you're noticing in many classrooms, professional development occurs. But if it's just 1 or 2 classrooms that are having the issue, then it's more focused with those individuals. Okay, so let's go on now and look at checks for understanding. Checks for understanding really is planned out in the first part of planning with the mastery objectives. How will I assess whether they know it or can do it? And there are 3 essential lesson elements that RBT shares with us. The first one is the objectives, as we just talked about, all those criteria to be a good objective. And what should students know and be able to do? We're going to talk now about this 2.3 checks for understanding. How will we know if they can, how will we know if they know that they can do it? And how will they know that they can do it? So it's frequent at critical moments throughout the lesson. It assesses the progress toward the objective. It's gathering data about all students, not just 1 or 2 who raised their hands, but it's getting data from all. And it's used to adjust instruction. And criteria for success, which we'll talk about later, it's what does proficiency or an excellent job look like? So those are the 3 lesson essential elements: the objectives, the planning for how you're going to check for understanding from all students, and then criteria for success. How will students know that they met that objective? So on your framework for 2.3, you can see the boldface words for check for understanding. They occur frequently at critical moments. It assesses student progress from all students, and then as instruction is adjusted based on the feedback received. Okay, so there they are again. Really critical, this part about all students. Teachers generate a lot of questions as warm-up, only getting answers from maybe 2 or 3 students and not everybody. That's really not a check for understanding. It has to be from all students. So some ways that teachers check for understanding from all students are exit slips, dry erase boards, stick questioning, the do now, graphic organizer, some of those red, yellow, green response cards. Teachers walk around and check off their with a clipboard and monitoring groups that way. Lots of ways to check for understanding. The other part of check for understanding, the other part for objectives for learning is this criteria for success. Criteria for success is aligned to the objective. It's communicated and explained to students prior to beginning an assignment. And we'll take a look at what we mean by this. Criteria for success are qualities that must be present for student work to meet the standards and be deemed successful. What should we look for in examining student work to know if it is successful? What attributes should we use to judge the effectiveness of student work? So rubrics are not always needed, but criteria are. Clearly, that's a distinction between what a rubric is, which is more associated with a score, and a criteria, which is more associated with descriptions of what the students need to do to demonstrate mastery of an objective. And criteria for success is aligned to the objective. It's communicated and explained prior to the assignment starting. It names the product. It's stated in present tense. It sufficiently describes the characteristics of that product, or it could be a performance. It uses student-friendly language or drawings, and it forms a complete sentence. Names a product or performance, stated in the present, describes the characteristics of a proficient product or performance, uses student-friendly language or drawings, forms a complete sentence. For example, your learning log. There's the product. Your learning log. What do you have to do? What does the student have to do? Summarizes the major events in the chapter. Identifies the central conflict and progress towards its resolution. Includes your own reflections on the decisions that the protagonist has made. Students can self-assess with a criteria for success. They can look at their learning log. They can say, did I summarize the major events? Did I identify the central conflict? Do I have my own reflections? So teachers, this can help teachers too, because instead of saying you didn't get this right, the teachers could say, go back to your criteria for success and make sure you got all these points. Your lab report. Your lab report lists all the steps for the process of whatever, photosynthesis. Okay, product. It explains your observations. It explains your conclusions about the relationships between blank and blank, and it uses technical terms correctly. Notice these verbs are all in the present tense. Your sharing of your independent reading. So I remember Deb Reed saying there was a teacher who said that the students had to do a book report and share something that they were reading. Well, students didn't know how to do that, didn't know what that meant. So she created the criteria for success for this performance. You're going to share your independent reading, and here's what your sharing includes. It includes the title and author of your book, the most interesting parts, at least one vocabulary word that is new or interesting to you, and a prediction of what will happen next. Clear identifications for students to self-assess. They'll know what they have to do in order to meet the objective. Your text annotation includes references, questions, and comments, connections, paraphrasing of text chunks, main idea statement, and ownership of all unknown vocabulary. Start and define unknown terms. Clear identification of what that student needs to do in order to meet the objective. These are the examples of what we mean by criteria for success. It's aligned with the objective. It's communicated and explained prior to the assignment. It names the product or performance. It's stated in present tense. It describes the characteristics of a proficient product or performance. It uses student-friendly language or drawings, and it forms a complete sentence. So let's see the differences now between some of these words, and there's purposes, different purposes for each of them. So we talked about that objective. It's what the students know and are able to do by the end of the lesson. We talked about criteria for success, those attributes or descriptions of a proficient product or performance. Now, we talk about activity and directions. Activities are what students or teachers do, or what they will do, and directions are what the teacher tells students to do. So be aware, sometimes the activity and the directions get confused, or the activity and the objective get confused. Real clear distinctions between four of these important things that students do. So let's see if you agree that these are, if they're well written. Your picture includes, and the teacher has all of this for pre-K. This is a pre-K classroom, and this is the teacher's criteria for success. Your picture includes, and all those things. So in your head, think, is that a good criteria for success, or is that not good? Does it name a product or performance? Is it stated in present tense? Does it describe the characteristics of a proficient product? Is it student-friendly? Does it form a complete sentence beginning with a beginning stem? For the most part, it hits those criteria, but I would say that we don't want to number criteria for success. Some students could read this as your picture includes one line or two shapes. Or they may look at the example there and say, do I need to have three squiggly lines and one straight line? Or they may look at those shapes and say, am I supposed to have exactly that looks like that? So it's not the best because of those numbers, and also because the student may interpret what's on there as drawing is what they need to draw. And then, what do I fill the white space with? And am I adding words? Am I writing sentences? What does that look like? What words am I adding? So it's not the best, but some say it fits it, some say it doesn't. I defer to this one not meeting it, and it's simply because you shouldn't be numbering these. Kids, there's no order to how to do this. So on the chalkboard of a 7th grade class, that SWA, that means students will be able to. So the teacher writes, students will be able to, and I would encourage teachers to write, students will be able to out, or you will be able to out instead of using those initials. Okay, so the objective was identify the bones in the upper body and describe their functions. And the exit slip is an annotated skeletal model drawing. Your skeletal model drawing includes each of the upper body bones, accurately labeled upper body bones, description of function of each of the upper body bones. So again, this one hits the criteria that are listed there on the left, but the thing is, it says it's an exit slip, which criteria for success, something that's happening with a criteria for success should really be happening within the context of a lesson so that the teacher can get the feedback and adjust instruction if needed. At this point in time, an exit slip may not be the best place for this criteria for success. So I would say that the way the criteria is written is good, but at what time it's done, the exit slip, it's too long of an activity for this to be an exit slip ticket. Your poetry annotation. Read through the poem. As you read a second time, find and highlight examples of figurative language. Label each highlighted passage as metaphor, simile, personification, or hyperbole. So as I was reading this, you're probably thinking, that's not good, because that's directions. They're telling the students what to do. Read through the poem. As you read a second time, highlight examples. So it's nothing that the students are self-assessing themselves with, it's what they're doing. I mean, one could argue that the last bullet is pretty close to being a criteria for success, where students are labeling highlighted passages as metaphor, simile, personification, or hyperbole, but the first two bullets are directions. Observing the ants. Write your name, write the date on the left side, draw what you see, describe with words what you see, put your paper in the basket. Okay, again, directions. These are not criteria for success. You shouldn't have them numbered. Go back to the objective. What is the objective of this lesson? And that's what's going to drive the criteria for success. Again, one could argue, number 4 there, describe with words what you see. That and the drawing what you see could fit 3 and 4. The others are directions, but 3 and 4 need to be worked on a little bit more. Knowing what the objective is going to help drive the criteria for success. Now, this was a case where the teacher was actually teaching the students how to do turn and talks. Your turn and talk includes physically turning and facing each other, taking turns speaking, asking questions of each other, staying on topic, and being ready to share out with the class. So these are pretty good. It's about turning and talking criteria for success. Students can self-assess, and they meet all those criteria. Procedure writing. The purpose of this task to provide directions on how to do something or make something. So that was the purpose of procedural writing. Success criteria was, I included the title, I explained the purpose, I listed all the materials I needed, I included the steps, and I used transition words. I ended with a conclusion. So as I read that right away, you're looking at that verb, and it's not written in the present tense, so this is not good criteria for success. Something like your procedural writing should include a title, a purpose, the materials needed, and so on. So when a teacher is communicating criteria for success in the class, whether it's face-to-face or virtual class, that needs to be public. All students need to know what that criteria for success is. It needs to be precise. It needs to be prior to the lesson. It needs to be printed out, whether it's on the whiteboard or some chart paper, or students have it hard copy of it in front of them. They need to see it, and it needs to be presented. The teacher needs to go over it with them. So call these the 5 P's of communicating criteria for success. And it's, if you look on the rubric there for the framework for 2.3, that student self-assessment part, students are taught and expected to self-assess their work in relation to established criteria. That's what we mean by that descriptor. So I won't take time. We'll send you the link to watch this video. So you are going to watch this video, and then it's really about using criteria for success that we just talked about for students to self-assess and revise their work. And then you're going to write a CEI. So you're going to collect your evidence, watch the video. It's about a 6-minute video. Take notes like you normally do. Decide on what you want to talk to that teacher about. Pretty much aligned to that 2.1 criteria for success. Generate a claim statement. Support that claim statement with at least 2 pieces of evidence. Generate an impact statement. Any questions that you might want to think about for asking that teacher, and then generate some possible action steps for that teacher to take. So I will send out that link to you when I send this video recording. And one thing I want to talk to you about in the Red Book is planning decisions, things that teachers can think about as they're planning a lesson. And even if they have a high quality instructional material lesson plan that's already completed for them, they can take a look at that and use these 21 planning decisions on page 497 to 498 and kind of align and make sure that this lesson fits all those decisions. One thing that might be missing is that criteria for success. And maybe that's something that teachers need to generate, those criteria for success. Okay. So remember about that CEI. The claim is a statement about what the teacher did. It means a high leverage practice, whether it's present or absence. So, and it's tied directly to one of those indicators. So it's a statement about the teacher. The evidence is those literal quotes, whatever the teacher said or the teacher did and what the students said and the students did. And then the impact is always about the student and has that transition word, as a result, the students. And then questions align with the CEI. What did they decide to do? Why did they do it? What changes might be made? Avoid questions that are really suggestions. I always like to think about this questions as, you know, I noticed that and I wonder why. That always helps generate some questions for me. And to go through that process of notes to communication. Remember, you are collecting data, taking notes, thinking in your head, what's the likelihood of student learning, identifying that objective, drafting that claim based on that evidence, what you want to talk to the teacher most about, thinking about questions you have for the teacher to clarify the questions, and then hold your conference and then do the final write-up in DSC. Okay, so I am going to exit out now because that's the end of this presentation. And I will let you know that one thing you have to do is you have to watch the video that I send you, write up a CEI cue, send that to me, Angela, and I will give you some feedback based on that. Okay, and that's